All right.
Small class.
Hey, well, there is an audience out there. So the midterm goes out today. It will be up on the website after class is over, and I'll hand it out before we break. So, any questions or comments about the reading or anything that we've seen before? Current events. Okay. All right. I wanted to do a piece because I actually did some research on a certain brand of activism that I realized had some ancient roots. So the whole notion of, this is actually comes from a talk that I do that's actually a drug prevention talk for athletes. Because as a drug counselor, one of the things that I noticed is that athletes are at particular risk, especially in America. So not only in higher education do you have a whole issue around increased substance use between high school and higher ed with the Association of Alcohol in College, which is basically an 800-year-old tradition that was only partially interrupted, to the degree that it was interrupted at all, or at least addressed, by Ronald Reagan in the 80s, which we haven't gotten to yet, but we were talking about drug laws and drug policy. So in the black community in particular, there is a history of athlete scholar activists. So while Paul Robeson, who was a 3-position All-American, I think 2 in football and 1 in hoops, but is mostly known for his singing and acting career. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar from UCLA and the Lakers, and my uncle, Brol Toller, who was the first black ref in the NFL, coming out of USF, the USF Dons, where that football player, the number 55, basically the position he was playing when a team from, I believe it was Florida, was not going to take the field in a bowl game because they had 2 black players, Burrow being one of them, and Ali Matson, who later played for the Rams, being the other. So the Dons forfeited the game rather than bow to racism. When faced with the same choice, the Oregon Ducks in the 20s basically had recruited 2 black players from LA as the first black Duck players. They decided to take the field without their black players. So there's history of, dealing with inequity or not. So some of my role models, including my dad, who was a scholar athlete as well, in hoops, and Peter Norman, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and I kind of glanced over this the last time, but I'd actually done some work with John when we both worked in LA, working with what we would call today at-risk youth or gang-related youth. I was working with an anti-vandalism project, which was essentially dealing with tagging, what we call tagging. So basically, kids that had been caught by the police tagging would come in for counseling. John was working on a project in South Central, which is where we first met. So the talk was called Beyond the Field. So the lifetime goal is kind of balance after sports, because with what is addressing this need today, what has been happening is that a lot of role models aren't really talked about, or the role models that are presented to youth are either entertainment stars or sports stars, or so the goal is being a rapper or getting a professional sports deal. Now, in all of professional sports, there's only 2,000 jobs in the United States, period. 2,000. Right? So it's actually more likely for people to become a doctor than to become a pro athlete. But they aren't necessarily pushed towards that. So when we talk about, when I do this talk with, the LCC athletes, the lifetime goal is balance after sports. So within sports, while you're playing, optimal physical, mental, emotional, and even spiritual balance towards a certain goal, because athletes are, sort of programmed to be goal-oriented, right? But you're student athletes, so the idea is that you're supposed to be students first and then athletes, but that often the priority gets flipped by the institution, not in your best interest. So you should always be suspicious when that happens. When the goals of the institution become not your own, then you're in a lesser power position, which means you're going to be exploited. Got to watch out for that. Just understand that that's often what the game is going to be.
What do you mean by that?
There is a book, $40 Million Slaves. Basically talking about expanding on Harry Edwards. You ever heard of Harry Edwards? Black sociologist. Started out at San Jose State, associated with the program that John Carlos and a bunch of other people ran for. Then moved to Berkeley and basically talked about how it's an aspect of racism that's in professional sports and in college sports, whereas they will basically play you for your athletic ability, but as soon as you're hurt, you are cut to the curb. Okay? And they don't necessarily, theoretically, if you get a college scholarship, the assumption is you're a scholar, right? But if as soon as you're not able to perform, you're gone. And then where are you? So that's why, at least in the black community, there is this whole focus on, okay, what are your graduation rates? So what we see is there's a disparity in historically black colleges and universities where you have black coaches. The graduation rates among black athletes is like double that of mainstream institution. Like in the 90th percentile rather than the 20s or 30s. Same sports. So you're telling me a black coach is more concerned with graduating black athletes than a white coach is? The numbers would tend to indicate that. Why is that? There was a piece on radio this morning about USC is graduating, is basically starting their finals week, right? So there was a house party, 2 different student houses. There was a noise complaint. 70 police officers in full riot gear showed up to the black house and arrested 6 black students. Last night.
Wow. What? Where?
Last night. It's on NPR.
Where?
LA, USC. USC is in the heart of the hood.
Was one of the frat houses?
Wow.
Yeah, one of the frat houses. And what was interesting about this particular piece is that across the street, they had this big town meeting where, the police department was responding, and so it sounded like a black commander asking, well, do you think this is racial profiling? All the hands go up, and he says, well, I noticed it's, black hands, white hands, Latino hands going up, and this woman, she says, I'm white. We were having a house party across the street. We were noisy. No police came to us. So yeah, we think it's racial. I don't care if you got a black commander or a black captain. 70 people in riot gear to respond to a house? No. There's an issue. There's definitely an issue.
What part of the city was that?
Oh, South Central. USC is basically, around the Coliseum. Mm-hmm. Right? If you don't know LA, then but that's what it is.
Yeah, that's like right by the corner of the hood.
Yeah, right. That's the hood, essentially. Right? So part of the piece in terms of looking at, when we look at the examples of Robeson, Kareem, Dad, Burl Toller, John Carlos, there's a standard of reference, and that's why I'm always talking about in terms of, look, I ain't got no problem with you playing sports for a school, but I don't want you to get played, okay, by the people who raised me. say, watch out for this. Now, I was a high school radical, like you couldn't guess that by now, so I'm not gonna play sports. Because we're busy dodging tear gas, climbing fences, the 50-yard dash and the 8-foot fence climb. So scholar athletes. So this is, I'm quoting from a lecture that John Carlos gave at the University of Oregon within the last year. So, and he basically said, are you going to school or just going through school? So his comments were, you have to feed yourself, books are food for your life. So not just to excel in classes, but to excel in life. And another direct quote from him that I really picked up on is, athletics is like a stepping stone. It's over before you know it. So your performance can inspire others to excel in whatever endeavor they aspire to. But basically, from this perspective, because we're basically the same age, right, this is your life right now, but it can be over even if you go pro. And so there are a number of athletes, particularly in football, that are saying, no, would I want my kid to basically get brain damage in football? No. We don't want to do that. So it's basically, use your athletic career to get into and out of college successfully, but move on. Because once you age out of being able to do it, and this is what John's talking about, look, you need to be able to excel in other areas of life. So that's him, the U of O, and about a year ago when his book came out. So, athletes that are activists must break the rule that people obey their oppressors must follow. The fear of offending their oppressors or exposing oppression. Athletes are often relegated to a position of simply being part of an entertainment industry. Right? Look at all the money that goes to it. Supported by, look at the advertising that's on any sports broadcast. Who's doing it? Alcohol companies, etc. Cars. You may be seduced by the possibility of a large paycheck eventually. But only if you're able to perform both physically and mentally. And part of the piece of dealing with large paychecks is if you are not trained to deal with that form of money as a form of power, you will piss it away. Okay? So one thing that happens in terms of looking at money is that the trappings of success, that is big houses, cars, and stuff like that, cars are not a form of wealth. They decrease in value. Okay? So buying a Maybach, buying a Rolls Royce, doesn't matter that it costs more than my house, is going to decrease in value and you can't live in it. So often what happens, and if you look at, say, like a Magic Johnson, right? Yes, he had a great career with the Lakers, et cetera, but he got into other businesses to a position where he could buy the Dodgers. Why? Because this is the team that had the first black player, professional, and that's a symbol for him. So, athlete scholars perform mentally after the field activities are over. Beyond the field, you train for performance. So one of the greatest threats to that performance is various types of addiction. So what I call induced ignorance addictions. So not only induced ignorance about how drugs work, but also other addictive processes. They don't keep you focused. And they're things that, like Robin Williams once said, cocaine is God's way of telling you you're making too much money. Right? People get strung out. And one of the things I observed as a high school drug counselor is that when you deal with these athletes who famously have these big cocaine habits, their drug habits did not start as pros. They started as high school, and as long as they performed on the field, the coaches would ignore it. And that becomes a problem, because they can become physically addicted, and as long as they're performing, people will ignore their health until they implode. Oh, isn't that terrible? Yeah, okay. So, I'm not actually repeating this, but I'm looking at, just pointing you towards John's website and explaining what this was, right? So the picture is explaining. So you go to his website in the bio section and there's a radio interview. So these three folks, Peter Norman, Tommy Smith in the middle, and John Carlos. So the picture, people flash this picture without explaining the hidden significance, and I think it's not really good of an ethnic studies teacher to like pass that by. Right? And so I decided to dig a little bit more, right? So you don't necessarily see this in this picture, but all three of them are together. They are all three athlete activists. And that's not usually explained when they see the picture. Oh, these black guys are raising the power fist, and, well, who's this white guy? Well, turns out they're in solidarity. So Tommy and John are, you can't see this in this particular picture, they are barefoot. Basically, that's symbolizing black poverty. The black gloves is a human rights salute, not a black power salute, according to John and Tommy, and I'll explain that in a little bit more. So, figuring that you might follow this track, and I'm not just doing it, you should look into the various aspects. This is actually a Wikipedia reference here, because you can see the highlighted thing. 2 U.S. athletes received their medals shoeless, but wear black socks to represent black poverty. Smith wore a black scarf around his neck to represent black pride. Carlos had his tracksuit top unzipped to show solidarity with all blue-collar workers in the U.S. and wore a necklace of beads, which he described were for those individuals that were lynched or killed and that no one said a prayer for, that were hung and tarred. It was for those thrown off the side of the boats in the Middle Passage. All three athletes wore Olympic Project for Human Rights badges after Norman, a critic of Australia's White Australia policy, expressed empathy with their ideals. And what the White Australia policy was a policy in Australia started in 1901, which encouraged white immigrants to come to Australia to displace not only the indigenous Aborigines, but also to outnumber any immigrants of color from Asia and the Pacific. So it was like apartheid in Australia. And he's a white Australian opposed to that. So the Olympic Project for Human Rights was started by sociologist Harry Edwards, who had urged actually black athletes to boycott the games. Reportedly, the actions of Smith and Carlos were inspired by Edwards' argument. So this was 16 October 1968. Part of why Harry wanted black athletes to boycott the Olympics in Mexico City because of what was happening in Mexico City with the government killing students who were protesting unjust conditions in Mexico, and the assassination of Martin Luther King, which even back then, many of us suspected the government had a hand in. And it's like, okay, we are not going to, uplift America and so the other piece that John was talking about, this was the first Olympics in history that was going to be televised in color globally. So this is a perfect opportunity to basically advertise and symbolize various struggles on the world stage. Now, there are some people that say, oh, well, you know, the Olympics, you shouldn't politicize the Olympics. Well, you know, Hitler did it. Basically having the 32 Berlin Games, you know, and talking about white supremacy, and Jesse Owens kind of blew that out, right? Black runner. Now Jesse's wasn't overtly political, but I mean, he did make a statement. But times got rougher. So this is the 60s. So both athletes intended bringing black up to the event, but Carlos forgot his, leaving them in the Olympic Village. It was the Australian, Peter Norman, who suggested Carlos wear Smith's left-handed glove. For this reason, Carlos raised his left hand as opposed to his right, differing from the traditional Black Power salute. The Star-Spangled Banner played. Smith and Carlos delivered the salute with heads bowed, gesture which became front-page news around the world. As they left the podium, they were booed by the crowd. Smith later said, "If I win, I'm an American, not a black American. But if I did something bad, then they would say I'm a Negro. We are black, and we are proud of being black. Black America will understand what we did tonight." Now, many people think that their medals were stripped. They never gave up their medals. So they retained their medals. But they were kicked out of the Olympic Village by the, well, this is what John calls them, so the racist Avery Brundage, who was head of the Olympic Committee, and he did have a history of anti-Semitism and being racist too. So, if the Olympics aren't political, why have a racist as the head of it with a known anti-civil rights record if it's not political? So, we talk about then athlete activists. So when you talk about, like, for example, Spartacus, right? So everybody's familiar with the movie, but athletes who become activists follow a human rights tradition with ancient roots. Now, Spartacus was a leader in the third servile war against Rome. So there were 3 slave revolts. And that was just the third, inside of a century. Where, you know, you have these celebrated athletes, you know, who kill each other, considered property by the dominant culture, and they revolt and win military battles. Now, I'm not suggesting all professional athletes do an armed insurrection against the United States. I'm not saying that. There are levels of activism, right? Today, many athletes are fed a diet of addictive performance-enhancing drugs, much like American slaves were given cocaine as an inducement to continue working. Now, we didn't really need Django to tell us about, you know, those Mandingo fighting. That's not fiction. That kind of stuff actually did happen.
I don't know about the cocaine thing.
Yeah.
What happened?
Cocaine was fed, you know, one of the more, you know, American slaves were fed cocaine. So generally speaking, when we study to the degree that we have data about drug use patterns back then, overseers were drunk. So black slaves did not get drunk because, well, here's the role model, we don't want to be like them, right? And they're not going to be given access to alcohol anyway. But they would be given and were given cocaine as an inducement to work, because what cocaine does is it shuts down your hunger and makes you feel like you can work harder, right? And so the same thing that was done by the Spanish to Native Americans in South America was done to American blacks in the South. The masters would give them cocaine as an inducement to work. So sometimes exceptions are made in enforcement of drug policies and drug laws with athletes. Is this in their best interest? Probably you should be suspicious about that. Okay, which leads me to continue from where we left off. So this analysis, axiochemistry, basically looking at the use of drug substances from medicine to weapons. So medicine, sacred mind, sacrament or sacred mind, inspiration, artistic or otherwise, leisure as a social lubricant, commodity, source of wealth or trade. Political tool, that is the accumulation of wealth, and the accumulation of wealth means power. And a weapon, either control of or elimination of a population. So in case this shows up on a midterm near you, you might be able to answer this cogently. So, weapon, control or elimination of a population. There's several different historical ways this happens. Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, talks about the best way to win a war is to have your enemy lose the will to fight. So, Chinese generals, in advance of invading a city, would supply that city with free rice wine. The defenders would get drunk, they'd be out of it at their posts, and boom, you invade. So, Chinese versus Chinese, rice wine, as an example. Persians versus the Greeks. They induced the Greeks to move through an area where bees were basically making honey from poisonous plants. The toxin gets into the honey, the Greeks eat the honey, they're sick, unable to fight. Boom. Chemical warfare. America versus First Nations. Distilled alcohol, right? That's the classic one that if Americans know about the use of drug substance as a weapon, they know about this one. The whole firewater thing. So, Native Americans, some Native Americans did have alcohol technology, but they did not have distilled spirits. Difference being kind of like the difference between leaf cocaine and crack. Okay? If you chew leaf cocaine, you deliver a stimulant dose of that drug, of the drug cocaine. So, eat coca leaf, you deliver a stimulant dose of cocaine roughly equivalent to a cup of coffee. If you don't have it the next day, it's no big deal. But 1,000 pounds of leaf makes a pound of cocaine. Right? So if you do a line of cocaine, or if you smoke a rock of cocaine, it's the equivalent of doing several plants at once. See the progression? 1,000 pounds of leaf, pound of cocaine, do a couple of milligrams of the drug cocaine, boom. Like doing several plants at once. So you get a mood spike, it becomes more addictive. All right? So, introducing whiskey, which got into European culture through the conquest of the Egyptians, where in Egypt it was a state secret. The Greeks and the Romans learned to distill alcohol, and then it got into Western civilization without the protections, the cultural protections that the Egyptians had, where, okay, we're not giving this out just to anybody. You have to be a trained practitioner. By the 1600s, the Puritans from England are giving rum to 4-year-olds as an inducement to put them to sleep. Right? So natives saw that and go, no, we're not going to do that. In fact, some of us, no, we are not going to trade. We're not going to let our tribal members drink, nor are we going to trade our lands for whiskey. First of all, we don't believe in real estate. Second of all, no, we're not going to trade our sacred Black Hills for cases of whiskey. So those people that maintain those values were specifically targeted by the United States government, either killed or imprisoned in mental institutions, particularly chiefs or medicine people that wouldn't trade or forbid their tribal members from doing alcohol at all. No firewater. Those people were killed off. And then you flood the reservation with whiskey. Now, many people don't know, because I studied the policy, it was illegal, federal law, for Native Americans to drink alcohol before 1952. Illegal. Indian agents, that is, Bureau of Indian Affairs agents, hired, white guys hired by the government. Bureau of Indian Affairs was actually under the War Department. Okay? They controlled reservations, flooded reservations with whiskey. It was illegal, with the full knowledge of the U.S. Congress. That's chemical warfare. Right? Generating the host of problems that we see in Indian country today, as well as in Black America, with liquor stores. Yes, Armin.
What's First Nations mean?
First Nations is basically the indigenous people. First Nations is a Canadian term.
Okay. That's like, yeah, the First Nations of America.
Yes, before it was America. First Nations of Turtle Island. Britain versus China. Opium. What does it have to do with the price of tea in China? That's the clue. What happens at 4 o'clock in the British Empire?
Tea.
Tea time. Where do they get their tea? China. Right? What do the Chinese want for their tea? Nope. They don't want opium. They want gold, silver, cash on the barrelhead. Thank you very much. The British have a colony called India at the time. Opium was illegal in China. It was legal in India, which was a British colony. So the British paid smugglers to smuggle opium into China. The Chinese did not take very kindly to this. And Chinese officials dumped 10 tons of British opium into the South China Sea. Britain went to war with China. China lost. Terms of surrender, the British opium trade is protected in China, thereby greatly producing addicts. So the association with Chinese opium dens, the Chinese had their opium habit enforced on them by the British. So when we see opium dens, and there's even a reference to in old, Eugene history, but also in San Francisco as well, opium dens in large cities, that's where that habit came from. Right? So, use of a drug as a weapon. So, American state control over or influence over the illegal drug trade, which we'll talk about more when we get to the 80s. But as an example, allowing the Italian mafia to flood black communities with heroin starting in the 50s. So when you saw the first Godfather movie and Marlon Brando says, who we sell this heroin to, and he says the niggers, that is not Hollywood. That actually happened. That is a historical fact. Okay? With the full knowledge of local law enforcement, so let's say if we take New York City. NYPD knew about it, didn't enforce the law. FBI knew about it, didn't enforce the law. So, no law enforcement, no drug treatment, full knowledge of these activities up to the federal level. No action. Okay, so the use of the drug trade as a weapon to pacify unruly populations. So, what happened then? What our response was, that is the black community, Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, us, the Uhuru movement, all fought against white-owned illegal drug trade for political and health reasons. Black Panther Party had prohibition, that is, no party member could shoot dope or be drunk or stoned while on party business. And also had a free heroin detox program in New York, led by Dr. Matula Shakur, who was an uncle of Tupac's. Yes?
I heard that the underground cities of like Philadelphia were like created to, at least they were used so that well-known figures like political and state officials could go do like drug deals basically there without having to worry and all that.
Mm-hmm. When you say underground cities, you mean literally underground? Because the reason I'm bringing that up is because certain places in Oregon had underground cities where the Chinese had to basically, you could be shot on sight after dark on the streets of like Pendleton. So they created entire underground little towns, like Pendleton and other places in Oregon.
Albany has some too.
Who?
Albany.
Albany? Yeah.
Yeah, I meant literally.
Yeah.
Philly has like a huge city.
Yeah. So again, since much of this illegal drug trade is happening, so I'm just saying, you know, what's been happening in the United States with the use of illegal drug trades to pacify populations is an old practice. Didn't start here, but it's definitely been developed here. And so the people that have fought against it, just like with First Nations, were targeted for various means. So, I mean, not that they didn't have lots of other reasons to target the Panther and us, but this is definitely another one. Okay? An addicted population is a controlled population. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail also when we get to the 90s, because my comment about liquor stores basically holds the same thing. The ghetto is a reservation, then how would you pacify a population that way? So we'll look at that. So, how much did we review? Did we do a history of drug laws here that you recall? Okay.
This term.
All right. All right, so let's start with U.S. drug laws. So despite the fact there was already widespread opiate use among white population at this time, so the first drug law, so the 1885 Iowa study and the 1887 pharmacist study, there were 250,000 middle and upper class addicts, mostly white. Actually, upper middle class in the mid-19th century, obviously going to be white. So here's a piece that also should be known. In this time, basically, in terms of Western psychology, i.e. Freud thought women were crazy. The term was hysterical. So the cure for this hystericalness was considered heroin. Understand, heroin is an over-the-counter cough syrup. In this time. It's a legal drug. Okay? Cocaine in Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola had cocaine in it. Coca-Cola had cocaine in it.
To give you that energy.
Yeah. I mean, I can show you ads. I usually save it for my drug class, but I mean, basically, when you see this, it's like, okay, well, this is normal. Right? So, despite the fact there's already widespread opiate use among the white population, who do they do the drugs? The first drug law against? 5 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1877, the federal government outlawed opium importation and smoking among Chinese Americans, while white citizens had no such prohibitions. All right? So if you understand, Chinese had their opium habits enforced upon them. They immigrate to the United States still carrying that habit, even though there's 250,000, they were referred to, they were the yuppies of their time. They were referred to as the opium eaters. So there's 250,000 opium eaters in the United States, but they passed the first drug law against the opium smokers, who are all Chinese. right? So 10,000 of those by the count. So the law gets passed against not only ethnic minorities, but the numerical minorities too. So 1900, the first anti-drug campaign in 1900 was targeted first at rural white males, which at the time were the largest group of users and addicts, immigrant groups such as Chinese opium smokers, and eventually Southern blacks. Now we should look at, oh, is there a drug problem among Southern blacks? No, but I'll show you how that works too. Federal anti-drug law passed in 1902 prohibited supplying opium for non-medical purposes to any Aboriginal native on islands not in the possession of any civilized power. So in other words, wait, we don't even own or control these islands, but these people of color, we don't want them using opium. So that's the second federal drug law. Again, targeted at people of color. So when we talk about drug wars historically in the United States, we're in, like, depending on how you count, the fifth one. The jungle. Upton Sinclair's book talking about unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry, that prompted what was known as the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which actually didn't clean up the food supply so much, though it did support, inspection of the meatpacking industry. Here's what it did. If you had a medicine that had opium in it, you had to declare that there was opium in it. So hidden opium. Didn't take the opium out. Just,
The jungle in LA, you mean?
no.
Okay, that's what I first came to.
No, this is Chicago meat packing.
Okay.
Right? Yes, there is a hood, part of the hood called the jungle, but. So with respect to drugs, this law essentially said you had to label any drug preparation that contained opium or cocaine. So our drug laws tend to be reactive rather than proactive. That is, we're reacting to a problem after it becomes known, but we don't act to prevent the problem, i.e. be proactive. So, continuing with this, the next drug law, there's a cancer cure. Somebody was promoting a cancer cure in 1911. Now, have we cured cancer in 2013? You think we've done it in 1911? Hell no. So, the Shirley Amendment, 1912, no false claims for drugs. Has to be proven that it works. Another incident, fear of cocaine-crazed Southern blacks. So this is why you have drug efforts targeted at black people starting at 1900, but continuing in 1914. And I got this piece from National Geographic. So National Geographic says it must be true, right? Anyway, fear of cocaine-crazed Southern blacks in 1914 led to the Harrison Narcotics Act. So beginning in 1877 as an official policy, beginning also in 1909, Hamilton Wright, a DC physician, who issued a report in 1910 that exaggerated addiction figures and played on the racial fears of whites. A pattern would be set for legislation thereafter, connecting perceived drug use of minorities and the potential harm for whites. Now, what the data showed, to the degree that there was data, that whites were and remain, adjusting for population, the largest drug users in the United States. Still. But the laws get aimed at people of color. So, Wright said in his report that cocaine gave blacks superhuman strength, made them bulletproof, and caused them to rape white women. It's also interesting to note, of course, there were no incidents or scientific objective data to back these assertions, even though he's a doctor. Cocaine makes black people bulletproof, superhuman strength, and rape white women.
This is before PCP?
This is before Angel Dust.
All right.
I don't know what he was on.
He was probably, well, I don't know. But what's often common with doctors is that they're strung out on opiates or cocaine. he could be projected. Yeah, it's possible. So, original position. This is from the psychology of law. And here's how are laws made? Well, what are they thinking? Well, you can see part of how they're thinking. Superhuman strength and yeah, okay. So, from the psychology of law, what is the problem that the law is addressing? 2, what's the solution to the problem? 3, and how is that going to solve the problem? How's the law solving the problem? Not so much, but they should think about this, is what are going to be the side effects of the law that you're passing, the unintended consequences, and what were they thinking? So the question is not whether race enters the equation, it does, but where it enters the equation and how far. Okay, the reason you ask that, and you should be asking that, is how's it going to affect you or those that you care about? And even if you're not a person of color, again, one of the central lessons of the class, what was once done to us because of race is now being done to you for the money. So you're best to be hip to the game. So, substance abuse problems are faced by every culture with a drug technology. So Larry Wallach, who at the time was at Berkeley School of Public Health, now is, I believe, at Portland State, made a comment, if a culture values all its people equally, then its response to substance abuse problems are medical/healthcare focused. It's a medical problem. If a culture does not value all its people equally, then social control measures are used against those with drug problems who have less power within that particular society. So, we'll look at then drug laws, that superhuman strength, right? Then also the temperance movement, which is basically the temperance movement was the first prevention organization, basically whose goal was to save the morals of America, and they clearly basically felt that excessive alcohol use was destroying the moral fiber of America.
Weren't they temperance women or something like that?
Yes, right. Carry Nation, taking axes to casks of rum and all that kind of stuff,
Right.
yes. Right? So that resulted in the 18th Amendment, which is prohibition. So with prohibition on cocaine and other drugs starting in 14 with Harrison Narcotics Act, people turned to alcohol. Right? You prevent one drug, prohibit one drug, people dodge into others because you haven't addressed the core issues. We see this in individual addicts today, happens with a nation, right? So with the end of the war, that is World War I, an increase in racial terrorism, a decrease in economic opportunity, many factors caused some whites and some blacks to join what we call today the underground economy in illegal alcohol production. This causes an increase of alcoholism in the black community with, again, no treatment because there's no science basically to say, oh, well, this is a medical problem. The idea, based on the views of the temperance movement, is that it's a moral problem. So even in 1600, when you're giving rum to 4-year-olds and they grow up to be alcoholic, domestically violent, it's not the alcohol that's causing it. They have low moral character, not a substance abuse problem. The substance abuse concept wouldn't be invented until the mid-20th century. So, temperance movement could be considered the oldest alcohol, tobacco, and other drug prevention movement in the U.S. During slavery, they allied with the abolition movement. In the 1900s, they allied themselves, among others, with the Klan, and were instrumental in passing the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the production of alcohol. Now, the reason they allied with the Klan is because the Klan basically felt that cocaine and alcohol use among blacks induced them to rape white women. That's why the alliance with the Klan, prevent alcohol use among black people.
How many people would do that? They're like, you know, they're gonna have an alliance with the abolitionists, but then also with the Klan too.
Yes, well, after we got freed, right, there's no more abolition. So now we're aligned with the Klan because we're down with preventing alcohol abuse in many populations, and politics makes strange bedfellows.